Hello, my friends. It's been a while, maybe a month, a little over a month since my last video. I'm basically working two full-time jobs called fatherhood and driving a tow truck 6 days a week. So it's been hard for me to really focus and concentrate on making content for you fellas, but I'm not going away anytime soon, and I'm back with what I think is a particularly interesting video today for you. I want to talk about a moment in history where a proto-communist movement sprang up among the international elite of the time. This was in the early 1800s. And I think it disturbingly foreshadowed some of the trends that we are seeing pushed by the elites today. Anyone who's spent any time around conspiracy circles and learning conspiracy theories will know that there are two main aspects of the elites today. The first is the promotion of a society where the state controls all property for the good of mankind. We are seeing this more and more. The state is trying to justify the continued expansion of its power to the point where it wants to basically control every aspect of our lives. And that they're doing this in the name of doing what's best for mankind. That's the first. Basically, moving toward communism. And the second is occult-fueled degeneracy, often of a sexual nature. And, when people see things like this shit today, I won't even play it with sound, I won't even play much of it. But when you see this kind of shit today on TV, being promoted to children, being promoted just about everywhere you look in the media. This is a Galaxy Z flip phone commercial from Samsung. You see this kind of shit everywhere, and a lot of people think that this is a modern phenomenon, that this is something that just started over the last few years. And also, a lot of people don't really connect the two aspects that I just mentioned. They don't connect this kind of degeneracy with the push toward communism. But there is a connection. And that connection is in occult mysticism. And I'll explain more about that as the video goes on, and I've gotten into that in previous videos. It's something that when you tell that to somebody who hasn't investigated these sorts of things, it makes you look pretty crazy. But the crazy thing is that it's true. The crazy thing is that there's tons of evidence for that, and that this isn't a new thing in history, that there are precedents for this that you can find by just looking into it. And one of these precedents that I found, I basically stumbled upon when looking at the Wikipedia page for Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was the developer of the Suez Canal. This Wikipedia page was randomly linked in my Discord by a longtime moderator and Discord friend of mine, Feed, who basically just linked this Wikipedia page, and I started reading into it. And what I found was kind of shocking. Turns out, as we'll find, there was a a religious movement in the early to mid 1800s called Saint-Simonianism. And Saint-Simonianism had both of these aspects that I mentioned, the push toward communism and the promotion of degenerate forms of sexuality, and among other things. Basically, it was in a lot of ways similar to Sabbatean Frankism in its repudiation of any kind of traditional morality, it seems like. And it was strongly connected with the highest members of the international elite at that time. This wasn't just a fringe movement. So let's get into this in the way that I kind of unraveled it for myself. So we get to the page for Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was a count, so a member of the aristocracy. And he was a French diplomat and later developer of the Suez Canal, which in 1869 joined the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. And as we scroll down here, we see, he's got old family origins. And it says here, while in Egypt, he encountered and was influenced by Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin, or I'll just pronounce it with my bad American accent, Enfantin, who was working on a dam north of Cairo for Muhammad Ali, the ruler, the viceroy of Egypt at that time, preaching for a union of the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. So, who is Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin, and how did he influence Lesseps? Here's the page for Barthélemy. He was a social reformer, one of the founders of Saint-Simonianism, and a proponent of the Suez Canal. Enfantin was born in Paris, the son of a banker. So he's a rich man and likely a you-know-who. And so here we get the first mention of Saint-Simonianism. Here we get some, when we read about what kind of preaching and politics he had. So it says here, after the July Revolution of 1830, Enfantin resigned his office of cashier at the bank, devoted all his energy to the cause, his political religious movement. Besides contributing to Le Globe, a newspaper, he made appeals to the people by systematic preaching and organized centers of action in some of the main cities of France. The headquarters in Paris were moved from the modest rooms in the Rue Taranne to the large halls near the Boulevard des Italiens. Enfantin and Armand Bazard were proclaimed supreme fathers, a union which was, however, only nominal, as a divergence was already manifest. Bazard, who concentrated on organizing the group, had devoted himself to political reform, while Enfantin, who favored preaching and teaching, dedicated his time to social and moral change. He wanted social and moral change. The antagonism was widened by Enfantin's announcement of his theory of the relation of man and woman, which would substitute a system of free love for the tyranny of marriage. This is something that we see promoted in the media today, how marriage and the traditional family unit, the patriarchal traditional family unit, is tyrannical. And when you look into this kind of thing today, you find that a lot of socialist and communist-minded people believe this kind of stuff, that the family, that traditional systems of patriarchal discipline, and even just the idea of monogamy in general is tyrannical, unfair, and that free love, basically, have sex with whoever you want, no limits, no restrictions, is the better way to go. So here we have this all the way back in the mid 1800s, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it gets worse than this. So from here, oh, by the way, there's more we can read here. His extravagances. So meanwhile, the new religion gathered believers in all parts of Europe. His extravagances and success at length brought him to the attention of the authorities, who argued that he was endangering public morality. Enfantin had announced that the gulf between the sexes was too wide, and this social inequality would impede rapid growth of society. Okay, so he was basically a feminist. Men and women should be equal. No more social inequality between men and women. And I'm not able to find right now where I saw it. But what did this have to do with the Suez Canal, first of all, before we start getting more into Saint-Simonianism? And I think this point is important because we have to recognize that these wealthy people, I mean, this guy was a banker, very wealthy. He's influencing and connecting with a count. These weren't just nobodies. They were part of these like chivalric orders and commanders of the Grand Cross, and these sorts of people weren't nobodies. They were influential, they were powerful, they were rich. And we have to understand that these influential, powerful, rich people think symbolically. They're very thoughtful. They have great attention to detail. And they have a great capacity for and appreciation for symbolism, symbology. So what did this have to do with the Suez Canal? Where there's a page here about industry and the Saint-Simonians. And it says here, with an eye toward the dramatic gesture, Enfantin declared 1833 the year of the mother, and then organized an expedition that mimicked Napoleon's in ambition, though not in size. Quote, I heard from my prison, he wrote to a friend in January 1833, the Orient waking up and crying out. The Nile has broken through its dikes, and it gushes out farther than it ever has before, carrying the seed that Napoleon scattered on its banks, which Muhammad Ali now fertilizes. The Great Communion, this is the important part, I think. The Great Communion draws near. The Mediterranean will be beautiful this year. By early spring, he assembled a group of several dozen men and women. Most of them were engineers trained like Enfantin at the Polytechnic, which was one of the most prestigious, selective, and expensive schools in France at the time. Most of them were engineers trained like Enfantin at the Polytechnic. He also sent a delegation of his community to Constantinople, blah, blah, blah. Okay, here we go. The father's motives were a combination of the sublime and the mundane. He said that Egypt was the nuptial bed that would allow for the symbolic union of East and West. The East represented the female principle, the West, the male. The East, for Enfantin and his disciples, was that portion of the world civilization that emphasized the universal mother, the earth goddess. The West signified the father and the spirit of intellect, reason, and creativity. On its own, each was lacking a key ingredient, and for that reason the world was locked in struggle. Only when these two were no longer divided by centuries of human pettiness and distrust would universal harmony and prosperity be more than a utopian dream. Okay, so the Suez Canal. You have to understand the very project of the Suez Canal, which had immense economic implications, consequences to it, was not merely an economic venture for these ultra wealthy people. These people were already had as much wealth as you could possibly want. This is what we have to understand about the elites today too. They already have as much wealth and power as they could possibly need. So these kinds of ventures aren't necessarily just to make more money. They have a symbolic nature to them. They have a spiritual nature to them. If the damn Suez Canal has this occult meaning to the very people who created it, what do you think has occult meaning to the elites today? This kind of thing continues today. That's my point. We have to understand that this is how these kinds of ultra wealthy, ultra intelligent, international leaders, businessmen, financiers, elites, how they think. Okay, so anyway, that's how the Suez Canal got me into all this. So I started wondering, what's up with Saint-Simonianism? What's the deal with this movement? Wanted to learn more about it, so I clicked on the page for Saint-Simonianism. Okay, they call it a social, political, and religious movement, the first half of the 19th century, inspired by the ideas of Claude Henri Comte de Saint-Simon, another count, okay, another aristocrat. And this Wikipedia page doesn't tell too much about what it was really all about. It took a little bit more digging to figure it out. I mean, there's some clues here. It's part of the series on socialism, as you can see. It mentions things like abandoning traditional ideas of temporal and spiritual power. It mentions things like industrialization, scientific discovery, but it doesn't really get too far into the real implications of this movement. But there are a couple of interesting things. The first, following Saint Simon's death in 1825, his followers began to differ as to how to promulgate his ideas. In 1831, Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin and Amand Bazard, who we spoke of earlier, purchased the newspaper Le Globe as the official organ for their revolutionary fraternity, Friends of the Truth. Initially, both men were supposed to be co-leaders, naming themselves Supreme Fathers. However, Bazard left the group as it became increasingly ritualistic and religiously minded, with Enfantin founding a community at Menilmontant, where he decried marriage as tyranny, promoted free love, declared himself chosen by God, and began predicting that a female messiah would soon save humanity. In 1832, the group, led by charismatic Enfantin, was brought to trial by the July monarchy on charges of public indecency, specifically in regards to Enfantin's beliefs and practices associated with free love. Basically, they were having orgies. That's what you find when you look into this more. They were having orgies, and who knows what else. Because you know these kinds of people are into all kinds of shit. Pedophilia, homosexuality, all this kind of shit. It continues, following this, some of the followers went to Constantinople and Egypt, and they influenced the creation of the Suez Canal in search of messianic revelations, which we just talked about. But here's some more interesting bit. This is where it kind of branches off. Others who had been associated with the group were not followers of Enfantin, such as Olind Rodriguez, a French banker, a Jewish banker. They say French, but he was actually Jewish, and it says it on his page. We'll talk about him later. They developed Saint-Simonian notions practically and involved themselves in the development of the French economy, founding a number of leading concerns, including the Suez Canal Company and the bank Credit Mobilier, in my American accent. It has also been noted that Saint-Simonian ideas exerted a significant influence on new religious movements, such as spiritualism and occultism, since the 1850s. That includes theosophy, by the way, which I've done a video on how theosophy influenced the creation of UNESCO, and that many of the prominent founders of UNESCO, the UN's educational, scientific, cultural organization, were theosophists. So this was a precursor not only to socialism as a political movement, but theosophy as a spiritual movement behind the scenes, which played a role in the creation of UNESCO and the UN in general, really. Karl Marx considered the Saint-Simonians to be the patriarchs of socialism. So, where to go from here? I think the next thing that I clicked was this Simon Ganneau fellow. Simon Ganneau was a Saint-Simonian. He treated Christianity as a call for social reform. He's called a French socialist, feminist, sculptor, and mystic. He was influenced by Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin and the Saint-Simonian philosophy, particularly in viewing God as an androgynous or bisexual. So now we start to see the deeper layers of this weird religious political movement. And we start to see how it connects with the degeneracy that we see today in this kind of shit. Okay? You know, this isn't new, is my point. Ganneau's writings treat androgyny not only as a move toward religious salvation, the final stage of humanity, which, by the way, is something that even people like Jason Reza Giorgiani talk about in his weird Prometheanism religion. So androgyny is not only a move toward religious salvation, the final stage of humanity, but also as embodying the socialist concept on unity and balance in the world. He adopted the title of Mappa, a combination of mater and pater. Ganneau presented himself as an androgynous prophet with a beard and a woman's cloak. So basically he was a transvestite. In a new religion called Evadeism, a combination of Eve and Adam, based on his ideas for a redefined humanity, Evadam, and for a new era of female emancipation, gender equality, and social justice. According to Eliphas Levi, who was also a Saint-Simonian, who we'll talk about maybe in a little bit, Ganneau claimed to be the reincarnation of Louis XVII. A former phrenologist and sculptor, he spread his ideas via pamphlets and plaster figurines of a strange appearance, without doubt symbolically bisexual. His garret studio apartment in Paris functioned in the late 1830s as a salon for discussing his ideas, and he influenced many of the socialists and feminists of his time, including Alexandre Dumas, Alphonse Esquiros, Flora Tristan, and Eliphas Levi. So, the next thing I would talk about is Eliphas Levi, just kind of go over him, but I wanted to go back to some of these people associated with the Saint-Simonian movement and really just reiterate the point that this was coming from the top down. This was a movement of wealthy, well-connected people. One example is Henri Germain, who was the founder of Credit Lyonnais, a historic French bank. It was the largest French bank in the 1990s at that time, and in the year 1990, it was the largest bank in the world. And it was founded by this Saint-Simonianist. And just, to show you the legacy, to show you the genealogy, the way it connects to today. And just, to connect this to today, Credit Lyonnais, I should just call it Credit Lion, because I know I'm saying that wrong, became the leading lender to Hollywood studios in the 1980s. Clients included independent film studios, Castle Rock Entertainment, Weintraub Entertainment Group, Nelson Entertainment, Vestron Pictures, and Carolco Pictures. It also financed Giancarlo Peretti's takeover of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in 1990 for $1.25 billion. And a skeptic might look at this and say, well, who cares? There's no connection. It's just a coincidence that today Hollywood is promoting all kinds of weird, degenerate crap like this. And it just so happens that one of the biggest banking institutions to lend and fund the Hollywood studios in the last few decades also was founded by a guy who was part of a religious group that had this kind of occult aspect to it, where they were promoting these kinds of things. It's just a coincidence, but that's a pretty big coincidence, I would say. And it sort of defies logic. It defies any rational understanding of how the elites operate and how they maintain their agendas over generations. These people don't lose their grips that easily on their institutions, especially something as big as the biggest bank in the world. There is continuity that is maintained. One of the most important things to these people is maintaining their continuity. So, yeah, one of the biggest banks in the world, founded by one of these freaky Saint-Simonians. We also have this fellow, who was a Saint-Simonian, Francois Bartholomew Arlis Dufour, who was a silk merchant, leading exponent of Saint-Simonianism. He was involved with the Suez Canal project, very wealthy, and I guess there's not too much that I highlighted about this fellow, but just another example of a very wealthy merchant, you-know-who, that was involved in this movement. We also have Olind Rodriguez, who was a banker from a Sephardic Jewish family. He was a close associate of the Saint Simon, who continued to champion the older man's socialist ideals. And says during this period he published writings on politics, social reform, and banking. And isn't it weird that you always see these top level bankers, financiers, merchants, wealthy people promoting ideas of socialism, communism, collective ownership of property? It's because it benefits them. It's because they're the ones who will end up being the owners at the top. And you know, when you look at Saint Simon himself, here's the page of Saint Simon himself. Look at the schnoz. If that's not a Jewish nose, I don't know what is. So, okay. How else does it connect to today? I already talked about, I won't get too much into this because this is, this Levi guy was another Saint-Simonianist. He's a studier of Kabbalah, alchemical studies, occultism, all of these things that I've tried to connect in previous videos to show that these occult religions have had a very great influence on the elites of today. This is just more proof of that. It also talks about how he was influenced by the Rosicrucians, Plato. You know, we have to connect these dots in the big picture, but I guess it's too much for this video today. However, I will point out that it says he had a deep impact on the magic of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded by Aleister Crowley, who was an MI6 agent, member of the intelligence community, and also that he influenced Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, which, as I said earlier in the video, was a big influence on the creation of UNESCO in the UN. So this is another branch to delve on if you're really interested in getting through these kinds of navigating these waters. But what I found particularly interesting, and this is how I'll sort of end the video, is today what we're seeing in the era of COVID-19. You know what I'm talking about. In this era of the so-called pandemic, we're seeing scientists, quote-unquote scientists, science in general, experts, medical professionals, these sorts of people are being promoted not just, oh, by the way, oh God, look at that nose. Dear God, Saint Simon was a Jew. These people, these scientists, medical professionals, expert class kinds of people, they're being promoted not only as political and social leaders, and basically authorities to give our total obedience to, but as spiritual leaders. These kinds of people have an implicit morality, an implicit religion, spiritualism to them, where they believe that they are doing the best thing for everybody and that they are doing things for the good of mankind and that we need to just follow and obey. And this was straight out of the handbook of Saint-Simonianism, essentially. This is a major and I think a unique aspect of Saint-Simonianism that we are seeing brought into the modern era. And we can follow, obviously, the transition from this into Marxist socialism, into the sorts of quote-unquote democratic socialism that we see today. But this is the earliest example that I could find of this. And I think it's really fascinating that we can trace it back that far. So in his major work, this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, in his major work, New Christianity, He proclaimed a brotherhood of man that must accompany the scientific organization of industry and science and society. So he was also from an aristocratic family, by the way. He was fond of claiming he was descended from Charlemagne. These kinds of roots go deep. People think socialism was something that came from the working class. You gotta be kidding me. In his first published work, Letters of an Inhabitant of Geneva to his contemporaries, Saint Simon proposed that scientists take the place of priests in the social order. He argued that the property owners who held political power could hope to maintain themselves against the propertyless only by subsidizing the advance of knowledge. Continuing here, accordingly, in opposition to feudalism and militarism, he advocated an arrangement whereby businessmen and other industrial leaders would control society. The spiritual direction of society would be in the hands of scientists and engineers, who would thus take the place occupied by the Roman Catholic Church in the European Middle Ages. What Saint Simon desired, in other words, was an industrialized state directed by modern science, and one in which society would be organized for the productive labor by the most capable men. So, if this isn't what we're seeing today, then I'll be damned. Because this is exactly what we're all seeing happening today. And, you know, this could probably be an entire video unto itself, so I'll just kind of make it brief. But why is it? Why is it that this kind of weird degeneracy is so closely associated, so closely tied with this kind of push for total power, total control over society by an elite? I think what it comes down to is essentially hubris. I think what it comes down to is the idea that these people are megalomaniacs, that they see themselves as gods, and they see themselves as having no limits, and they take pleasure in transcending any kind of limitations that are put on them. And for the longest time, mankind understood that certain limitations have to be put on ourselves and other people for things to be good. Even the very distinction between good and bad is a limitation. And traditional societies understood this. Traditional societies were all about limitations, order, boundary lines, borders. And so these kinds of freaks, with all kinds of wealth and power, take a sick pleasure in coming up with the most depraved ways to cross lines, to destroy boundaries. So they see their own power as being unlimited. And this is what we've seen in Saint-Simonianism. It's what you can see in other movements such as Sabbateanism, Frankism. I mean, even this idea that science is going to make a perfect world, that their scientific knowledge is going to perfect the world. That in and of itself is sort of an overcoming, a transcending of boundaries and borders. That they think that there's nothing that can't be done with a sufficient amount of knowledge and power. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's what I think is happening. And there's, I think, a lot more that can be said about that, but once again, for the purposes of this video, which is already getting pretty long, that's what I'll say at the moment. And finally, to really end this video, sorry I've been gone for so long. I miss you guys. I miss doing videos. And come on into the Discord if you want. I'll post a link in the description. I really need to be back on the old grind of making videos. There's so much more that I want to talk about. There's so many things out there that are interesting. One of which is, did you know, by the way, this is the last thing I'll leave you guys with. Did you know that as early, there's all this stuff going on with Afghanistan. The U.S. is pulling out. Taliban are taking over. Interesting fact about Afghanistan. Did you know that as early as 1901, Afghanistan had a leader, a king, a ruler, that was initiated by the British into Freemasonry? That's kind of weird, right? I'm sure there's a story there to be told. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for watching.